In this video, I'll discuss black and white adjustments within Lightroom. One thing to consider when your intent is to accomplish ultimately a black and white image is that in your camera, often you'll have settings such as monochrome that will allow you to produce a black and white image directly from the camera. While I caution against this, as long as you're shooting in RAW, that won't particularly matter because your RAW file will preserve the original color information. But in digital photography, that color information can be vital to helping you achieve optimal black and white adjusted images. I'm going to show a series of screenshots here comparing just a simple desaturation of an image to the nuances you can achieve using the black and white color sliders in Lightroom and additional adjustments. In this before and after image, here the color image is shown, and the only adjustment on the right that's been made is simply in the presence panel of the basic panel in Lightroom Develop module. The saturation has been taken down 100%. The result is a very flat looking image. Just by looking at it, you see there's not a lot of contrast or pop in the image. If you don't necessarily trust your eyes in this context, go ahead and look at the histogram. Almost a third, a bit more of the histogram in the highlights area is completely empty. Particularly with black and white images, even if a small portion of the histogram on either the lights or darks is without any data or tones, it tends to look very flat. So in the original here, the contrast is quite good among the reds and the background, but when it's just reduced to the simple tones in the image, it turns out quite flat. So here, the saturation was returned to normal, and instead the black and white panel was used. This is in the HSL color black and white panel. Selecting black and white, you have the ability to adjust the luminance, which is lightness or darkness, of each individual color. So here the red and orange luminance was brought way up, the greens, aquas, and blues were brought down, and then some additional tone curves and clarity adjustments were made. Generally, bringing lights up in tone curves, positive, and darks down in tone curves will really embellish that contrast. This image shows the simple desaturation of the image, and you can see there's very little distinction between the tones, the gray value of the plant against the background. They're almost the same. Again, that histogram is lacking a lot of information in the light tones, and we can see just by looking at the image that it's very flat. So here, instead of simply desaturating, the black and white panel was used to lighten the blue, aqua, and green tones and darken slightly the yellow and orange tones of the background, and then some additional curves adjustments were made. Again, a simple desaturation, and here using the black and white color sliders and some tone curves for adjusting. Really makes that image pop. Here again, a simple desaturation. There's very little distinction between the reds and the green values. Looks somewhat flat, so here some adjustments have been made using the black and white color sliders and again tone curves. Again, a very flat, simple desaturation. Here it was done using the black and white color sliders and some tone curves adjustments. Here again, quite a flat, simple desaturation. Here the color sliders allow the control to adjust that image optimally. Here there's essentially no distinction between the red and the green when it's turned to grayscale. They all have very similar tones or values, or shades of gray, if you will. But here, using the color sliders, a distinction can be made between the reds and greens and so forth, and just the contrast brought out quite a bit. The flowers, magenta, yellow, and orange all appear very similar in the simply desaturated image. Here, using the color sliders, a bit more distinction can be made. This is a very dramatic example. As you can see in the histogram and the image itself, the simply desaturated image appears very, very flat, but once the color sliders and luminance of each individual color as well as tone curves were used, it can really pop and almost has a glowing effect. This iris almost disappears into the background when simply desaturated, but can really stand out by making use of the color sliders in the black and white panel. In a case like this, for instance, where the purples and greens and browns are very similar grays, something like simply using tone curves or the other adjustment sliders based simply on lightness or darkness wouldn't necessarily help this to be able to stand out the subject from the background, for example. That's where the color information can really come in handy and control that specifically. Here as well, the plant almost disappears into the background, but using the color sliders, it's able to really stand out. Another example, the reds and greens are very, very similar in tone, but here using the black and white panel color sliders, we can see quite a significant difference. The browns and greens, again, very similar in tone. It would be difficult to achieve any distinction or separation of those simply using some of the non-color based adjustment tools. So the color sliders really help with that. Here too, quite flat, the simple desaturation and affecting the color sliders can make that really pop. And that concludes this slideshow presentation. I'm going to pick up after the slideshow showing the many different adjustments and do a live adjustment here just for reference and pointing out a few things that weren't addressed in the slideshow. So here the adjustments were made. If you recall, a simple desaturation of this image, taking away all of the color, made it appear very, very flat. So I'm just going to return that to the color state and instead use the black and white panel. So I'm going to click on black and white. If you notice, that's a bit different than the simple desaturation. Lightroom applies a black and white mix. It essentially makes decisions, usually they're not that great, about where they think the colors should go. I don't necessarily agree with this choice. I'd rather have the flowers be lighter and the background a bit darker. So I'm just going to click out of the before and after view. And here, if I don't know what colors are there, I could simply, adjust these sliders without knowing what colors there are. Or I could click on this target adjustment tool and click on a part of the image. And as you see, that's sliding the red and orange sliders toward the positive because I want them brighter. And then the background has adjusted the blues and aquas in the image. The yellows, I think, are best left as they were. I don't think there are many purples in the image. And at that point, now that I've gotten a little separation, I could go ahead and use curves or the basic adjustments, exposure and so forth, to go ahead and make the final touches desired. Okay. So it's not identical to the adjustment made before, but just something to consider.